Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the 2007 Virginia Tech shootings. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Anderson and Mr. Brill.
Okay, well, welcome, Mr. Brill.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask a few questions to get us going here, and then we'll open the floor up to questions from you all. Basically, I'm going to give you a softball here to start. We seem to be at a pivot point in American education, right? It's been 10 years since No Child Left Behind was enacted. We have a president who's articulated perhaps a new path in U.S. education reform, and we have states that are moving to make major changes in the way schools relate to teachers' unions and the way teachers are evaluated. And I wondered if you could just sketch out for us your view of this pivot point. What's at stake right now? What could change in the next couple of years? What could go wrong? And how might things be changing?
Well, I think those who care, and I assume everybody cares about improving public education in this country, can look at certain developments and say that's good news, and certain developments and say that's bad news. The latest developments are actually bad news. The Obama administration, in its new stimulus proposal, its new jobs plan, for example, has completely retreated from what it did with Race to the Top, which was to say, we'll give you more money for education, more money to hire teachers, if you embark on certain specific steps toward reform. And the basic idea of reform, but we should just say, because it's everybody's in favor of reform, but the basic idea behind what the Obama administration has done is something that will be familiar to everyone who has any kind of a job in any kind of workplace, except perhaps the suites of the Fortune 500 CEOs. And that is that how you perform on your job actually ought to count. And what shouldn't count is simply how long you've been on the job and managed to keep a pulse. So that's really what education reform at its core is about, which is let's hold teachers accountable for their performance. Let's hold principals accountable. Now, the Obama administration did that with Race to the Top. It has done none of that in offering the current bill. So that's a bad development. The other bad development is that most of the states that got the Race to the Top money, and states had to compete for it by offering to promise all these different types of reform. Most of the states that have gotten the money aren't doing much and don't seem likely to do much. The two really laughingstock states in that regard are New York and Hawaii, which are just never going to do any of this stuff. And the question is, will the Obama administration, assuming there still is an Obama administration next year, stop writing the checks and in fact go after those states and sue them to get the money back?
So we could be at a moment where we could be at a moment
so that's an element of bad news. Now the good news is there is, as you've said, lots of discussion about this. Lots of school districts and many states are moving forward. What Race to the Top really did was really accelerate the discussion and allowed people like our next speaker, Joel Klein, allowed what he's done and his views to have a much broader stage, if you will. So that's good, but I'm right now actually worried that we're going to lapse back. The Republican Party, which led education reform in the Bush administration, now seems to have been taken over by a conservative element that thinks that the federal government shouldn't be involved in education at all. And if you listen to the prior speaker, Ambassador Burns, you have to say, well, if we're going to be competing on a world stage, as we are, do we really want to do that with 14,000 individual school districts being the ones who are figuring out how we compete? And that seems to be the current Republican Party stance, which is really a disaster.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of teachers' unions in reform. This is something you explore at length in your book, and you seem to be a bit ambivalent about teachers' unions. On the one hand, teachers' unions seem to be the opponents of reform as you see it, standing in the way of efforts to measure what gets done and improve instruction. On the other hand, I think I hear you saying the teachers' unions are indispensable to reform. They are both opponents of reform and indispensable to reform. It can't happen without them. Correct me if I'm wrong in this.
No, you just got it right.
But I wonder if you could explain this to people, and is this just inherently contradictory or what?
Well, it is sort of inherently contradictory, but I'll explain it if I can just describe a scene in the book where I'm up visiting the co-founder of the KIPP network, which, as many of you know, is by far and away considered the most successful network of charter schools in the United States. And I'm sitting there with him a year ago, and I said to him, Dave, you must be really happy. You've got Race to the Top going on, you've got Waiting for Superman, you now have 100 schools, and they're all fabulously effective. Things must be really great. And he says, no, I don't feel happy at all. In fact, I'm really sort of down. I said, well, why? He says, well, even here, we're failing every day. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, here, I'll show you. So we left his office, he took a little notebook, and we went across the hall into one of his classrooms. And he stood in the back with me for 10 minutes, taking notes. Then we walked out, and he said, oh my God, we did five things just in 10 minutes. It was a miserable performance. Now, the classroom, to me, looked like your basic KIPP classroom. Riveting teacher in front of the room, kids sitting there, paying fierce attention to what was going on. So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I checked the homework log, and 2 of these kids hadn't done their reading last night. Did you notice that the teacher turned her back when she went to write on the blackboard, and she lost their attention? Did you notice this? Did you notice this? I said, oh, come on, Dave, this is chicken leap. What are you worried about? He says, that's what you don't understand. It's all about the chicken leap. Everything the teachers have to do, it's nothing, there's no glory in this, it's all about the little stuff. It's hundreds and hundreds of little things every day, every hour of every classroom. And he said, and we do it pretty well. He said, but let me tell you something. If you tore up every teachers' union contract in the country, every one of them, that would simply be a prerequisite. That gives you permission to start. But once you've done that, you have to train teachers to do the kinds of things I'm talking about. You have to motivate them. You have to recognize them. And there are 3.2 million teachers in this country. You can't do it with the kind of teachers, the young, best and brightest teachers who come to work at KIPP. It's 3.2 million rank and file teachers. So the answer to that, he says, is you've got to sort of create an infrastructure through training, through better technology, that Joel's going to talk to you about in a little while, through a whole variety of things. But if you can get the union to be your partner in that, if you can bend the union, not break the union, you'll have someone at the table to talk to who will do that. Now, there are places where that is actually going on. Hillsborough County, Florida, Pittsburgh is another example where they're actually starting to work with teachers. And you need some structure. For example, if you want to reward teachers who are effective, that all sounds like a good idea, and what you typically might do is you do peer observations for part of it, and then how much progress the kids make on basic tests from September to June would be the other part of it. Well, how do you test if what you're trying to gauge is the effectiveness of a music teacher or an art teacher? One answer might be if you find the 5 best music teachers in the school district and you sit them down with people from the school district and say, how would you figure out how to gauge the effectiveness of a music teacher? You may get further doing that than by, pushing some kind of reform on them. So that's that's the nature of the ambivalence. It's just being realistic that you have 95,000 public schools in this country, that are K-12, and you can't solve that with 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, really good charter schools, because you're not going to get 10,000 really good charter schools anyway.
So, just to sum this up, it seems like what you're saying is, if the question is, do you confront unions or collaborate with them, the answer is yes.
Both. You have to do both. I mean, the unions that I write about, they're now sort of bending. They're doing it because they have figured out that they do not want to be the next leaders of the United Auto Workers. They know which way the wind's blowing. And by the way, one other thing about all that is none of this is about money. The one thing Ambassador Burns said that I disagree with was he talked about investing in education. We just keep investing more and more in education every year. We have doubled what we've spent in the last couple of decades per student with no improvement. We spend much more per student than any other country in the world with nothing to show for it. This is not about money. There are aspects of the teachers' union contract that are so backloaded to these ridiculous pensions. If you took that and put that toward higher starting salaries for teachers and higher salaries for teachers who perform, that's what you need to do. But this is not about money. This is the investment we have to make is in the political will to confront the special interest, and the biggest special interest remains the teachers' union, especially for the Democratic Party. And President Obama apparently has now decided that it's going to be a tie election, and he's kept it.
Do you think that a Republican president would continue what Obama's doing, from what you've heard of what the Republican candidates are articulating, or do you think that a Republican president would retreat even further?
I don't know. I think, lately Herman Cain has been distracted from talking about education policy. I'm clear on that. You don't know. I mean, you don't. There has been no discussion. I mean, in the debates, the only snippet of a discussion about education in the Republican debates was when someone accused Mitt Romney of favoring race to the top, and he denied it, even though he actually has favored race to the top. So there really hasn't been any discussion. But traditionally, the Republicans have been, if you're a reformer, quote, better on this issue. But what made the Obama administration so effective was that this was a Democrat that was doing this, and there is a large movement around the country that is growing, that Joel Klein has helped to allow to grow, called Democrats for Education Reform, and they are, moving across the country and making progress.
I'd like to invite folks to start queuing up to ask questions while I keep going here. It's worth pointing out, isn't it, that vast parts of this country are served by schools that are in right-to-work states, which essentially are where teachers' unions have minimal presence and much less influence. And I wonder if the experience in those schools has anything to bear on all the questions we've just been talking about.
Well, it's worth pointing out, but it's also there are sort of several elements of this debate that sort of feel like the old debate, and it probably happened in this room 10 or 15 or 20 years ago over whether tobacco was bad for your health. And they just kept that debate going, the tobacco companies, as long as they could, and there's an element of the anti-reform argument that feels that way. One of them is, as you mentioned, is that in right-to-work states where the unions are weak, the student performance isn't any better than in the strong union states. Well, there's several elements of that are untrue. First of all, even in right-to-work states where the structure of the law for unions might be weak, the teachers' unions are typically very strong. Second, places like Florida and Louisiana are right-to-work states. And those states, the New Orleans school system is now one of the best performing school systems in the country. The advances that Florida has made. Am I losing this mic? Sorry.
Depends on which way you're headed.
The advances that Florida has made are really notable. So that's sort of one of the things that the deniers do is they use that kind of statistic. Another one is they say that the charter schools really do well because they get to cherry pick their students, which is just wrong. I mean, it's just factually wrong. It is a myth. It feels like, you know, the tobacco kinds of arguments. They don't. You get into a charter school, a good charter school, by entering a lottery, and you don't get to pick who wins the lottery, except by picking a ball out of the business. So the answer is no.
Before I ask a question, I would like to observe that the charter lottery process and school choice is an incredibly complex subject, and exactly measuring how the student mobility in the charter schools, and for that matter magnet schools, and how that affects student achievement is tricky.
Well, it's tricky at the margins. One of the arguments that I have when I give talks is someone will stand up and say, yeah, but the kids who go to charter schools, this is another of the union's favorite arguments, the kids who go to charter schools have unusually motivated parents because they entered them in the lottery. Now that makes a lot of sense, and it would be true, but for the fact that studies, including a very important one that Harvard did, where they followed kids who entered the lottery up in the Boston area, didn't get into the lottery. They followed those kids, and then they followed the kids who did get into the lottery and got into the charter schools, and the kids in the charter schools did much, much better, and therefore you have now just controlled for, you know, the so-called motivation of the parents. This stuff actually isn't very tricky, because I'll tell you something. There's another scene in the book where there's a charter school and a public school in one building in Harlem, in the same building. One of the things that Joel Klein, who's a former antitrust lawyer, did was he wanted to create a really obvious marketplace where you could see the charter school operate and the public school operate. It's in the same building, the same parents. On one side of the building, the charter school side, they spend less money per student than on the public school side. And one day I was watching a class, a 5th grade class, and the teacher was explaining to these kids how to do the topic sentence for an essay, and then how to map the essay. And I started writing it down in my reporter's notebook. And then I took another piece of paper and wrote down what she was saying a second time, and I sort of asked myself, why am I writing this down a second time? The reason was I wanted to put it in my pocket and remember to use it when I got back to Yale to teach the course that I teach in writing for journalists who are juniors and seniors at Yale College. This teacher had these same expectations, and she was right about those expectations, for those kids as I was going to have for these juniors and seniors at Yale. This is in the middle of Harlem, on the other side of the building. 10 feet away, I walked into a class, I watched a class, also an English class, also for 5th graders, where a teacher spent 5 minutes screaming at the kids, how many days in a week? How many days in a week? Same community, same everything. When you see those two scenes juxtaposed against each other, and as much as I hate to disagree with you, this is not a very hard debate. There isn't a lot of subtlety to that. It is obvious. Again, less money on the charter school side.
Mark Johnson from Corpus Christi, Texas. Would you comment on the effect of the failing family on our ability to educate children, and what do we do about that?
It's obviously very important. My kids were destined to do much better in school than the 5th graders I just described to you in that building in Harlem. There's no doubt about that. But we spend $600 billion a year on K-12 education, and I think that the responsibility of people like a Joel Klein when he was the chancellor in New York, his responsibility is to play the hand he got and to do the best they can with kids, even if they are from broken homes. And what the successful schools demonstrate and successful teachers demonstrate is you don't have to assume failure. And you don't get a free pass.
We're gonna segue here, and we're gonna invite Mr. Klein up.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.